Okay. You ready? Let's do this. You're listening to Explore Magazine's Live the Adventure podcast. This is the podcast that delves deep into the outdoors, will inspire, inform, and get you stoked to explore. And I'm your host, David Webb. Welcome to episode 13 of Explore Magazine's Live the Adventure podcast. I'm your host, David Webb. Let's talk about bikes. Let's talk about cycling and active transportation. Let's talk about healthy people and healthy cities. Let's talk about everybody getting along on the roads, getting around efficiently, getting around safely, and let's talk about lowering our carbon footprint. And finally, let's find out why bikes are more popular this year than they've ever been. Today, we're talking to Colin Stein, Executive Director of the BC Cycling Coalition, and we're going to get to all those topics and more on what is a very lively discussion about cycle advocacy, active transportation, safety, our current laws, where our laws need to go, and the future of cycling. Hint, it's huge. So stay on to hear from Colin Stein. And after you finish listening, surf over to explore-mag.com/gearbox. That's explore-mag.com/gearbox. If you like what you see on that page, enter the discount code PODCAST15 when you purchase, and you can save 15% on amazing outdoor gear. All right, get ready for Colin Stein. Colin, thank you for joining me today on the Live the Adventure podcast. I wonder if you could take a minute to introduce yourself and let me know about the British Columbia Cycling Coalition.
Yeah, great to be here, David. Thanks so much. So I'm the Executive Director of the BC Cycling Coalition, a provincially based member society in BC. We run a few education programs, which I can talk about in a little bit, but we also do advocacy. So we support local advocacy groups on the ground here. It's a province of 5 million people or so, and there's lots of little groups that work on cycling and active transportation. And then in terms of the provincial government, we also like to say work with them. We try to get their attention on some issues that we feel need addressing based on what our members tell us. And it's usually in the realm of legislation, policies, regulatory environments, and the investments in things like infrastructure, education, promotion, all the way down the line.
And how long have you been with the coalition?
I've just been with the coalition since January. So I came on board, had a few trips to meet some members and to go to Victoria on Vancouver Island, the seat of the provincial government, to meet some people. And then within a couple of months, we were shut down. So it's been an interesting time.
Yeah, I bet. So what led you there? What led you to the BCCC?
Yeah, the BCCC, also you could say BCCC, that's been my shortcut. What led me to the BC Cycling Coalition was a knowledge of who they were, spanning just back to 2013, but that was my first foray and really exposure to advocacy of any form, and particularly cycling advocacy. It was around the time when we were just a couple of years out here in Vancouver, where I live, from there being a couple of major downtown separated bike lanes that were put into some controversy and mostly great acclaim, and now significant, of course, use over the years. And so, terms like active transportation and that kind of thing, it was still somewhat trending. It was still somewhat new. So I spent a couple of years with Hub Cycling and really got turned on to the whole cycling advocacy world, and felt like I was able to understand it and have some impact, coming from a marketing communications background, but very focused on relationship building and interested in policy and strategy and just general management type of tasks. When this role came up, then a few years later, I saw, general management, some involvement with policy, some involvement on the ground, building relationships, and working on some of the tough issues. And so it felt like the perfect match.
And it must also be a passion of yours, because you don't get involved in the advocacy groups like this if you're not also a passionate cyclist yourself.
Yeah, and there's a couple of factors there. I mean, there's being passionate about, just through my entire life, always feeling like, and I feel like I'm using some of that language, which is very common now, but I didn't have words for it, but just always wanting to take the best option for transportation or travel at any given time. So growing up in Toronto, a lot of walking, a lot of transit use, and a lot of cycling. I got my driver's license late, but in my 20s, I found, of course, the enormous utility, sometimes necessary. But I found being in Vancouver and then traveling in various cities and towns around the world, I just felt like, around North America anyways, we were starting to catch up to elsewhere in the world where cycling and transit and a lot of multimodal use just was nothing that different or unique. So being part of a growing trend in Vancouver was definitely part of it. And then just advocacy generally, regardless of what type. I spent many years in the private sector doing the thing that I felt I could do well enough, which is, again, marketing and communications, but not always with a real attachment or my values connected to the product or service that I had a job in. And it's always been lucky to have a job, but to do something that you feel a personal connection to, you feel some passion for, can be a rare thing. And so when I found that in 2013 with Hub, and now to this day, I feel like I'm working my dream job. So it's not for the faint of heart. Not if you want to make a lot of money, but if you want to make a particular kind of difference in your community and in your world, for me, it's the place to be.
Can you let our listeners know, why do cyclists need advocates?
Well, that's a great question. Because advocacy is often, in any world, in any realm, like say health advocacy, housing advocacy, people who are pushing for better, cheaper childcare, or whatever it may be, the right to choose. You're essentially usually pushing for something that is something you're pushing for, as opposed to against, something that you want to see in your world, something that could be seen as progressive because it maybe is on the fringe, it doesn't exist yet through legal means, or it's not something that's really talked about or worked on. You could see, of course, gay rights, civil rights, current approach to certain types of recreational drugs. There's all sorts of things that have been on the fringe of society and that people want, and yet there's nobody necessarily fighting for them or really doing anything about it in government. Again, from a legislative perspective, largely is where it starts. But you could have a legal framework for some thing, and active transportation and cycling facilities is definitely part of that. But if there's no real forward movement that can help more people do the thing you're pushing for, if it becomes very difficult, if it's inaccessible, if it's inequitable, if it's unsafe, and all this counts, in the cycling world, you're left thinking, well, geez, it's legal to ride my bike, and everybody's encouraging me to do the green thing, the healthy thing, and this is what makes me happy, but I'll be killed. Like if I go take this route, if I try to get from A to B and there's no middle portion to connect these two routes, it feels like no one's looking out for me. The government is saying one thing but doing another, and where can I get some resolution to this? So that's where advocacy, in particular, of course, cycling advocacy, fits in. You see what we sometimes call gaps in the network. You see some inequities in the legislation, and you want it fixed. And this is what these groups, now largely, they're typically volunteers, people doing it evenings and weekends, but in many cities in North America, and I think around the world as well, you end up building up enough support for some of these measures where you get members, you get donations, you get sponsorships, and then you end up having staff in these organizations to actually do more work. And so that's the position that we're at.
You take a group of cyclists who are not organized in any sense, you know what I mean? They're just, you buy a bike, you're a cyclist, right? But so to have a voice for a collective group that's just made up of all types of demographics across the population is an important thing. Otherwise, there would be no voice, right? It would just be a bunch of individuals riding their bikes around and never really getting together and really pushing for things that they all want.
Yeah, and if you want something like financial incentives for e-bikes because they're growing, and it's what many cities want people to take up more than driving single occupancy vehicles, but you need to make it easier, so you want incentives. Maybe you want a relaxing, or maybe you want a law that's not relaxed. You want to tighten up how the roads are used, so safe passing distances, 1.5 meters, 2 meters, 4 to 6 feet, that type of thing, and you want to mandate that to make things safe. Well, there's a variety of approaches with advocacy where you can go exactly for what you're going for, but sometimes it's helpful because that's, essentially you're lobbing critiques at the government. You're trying to get them to change what they're doing. You're telling them that you know better than what they know. But there are some groups that actually get invited into the tent, so to speak. They take a different approach. They're able to provide more value, almost fee for services for the government to do some of the things that government doesn't have capacity for. So they're a little bit more in there. And then you have maybe more on the fringe, people taking a harder approach, really critiquing the government, hitting them hard, and sometimes asking for things that are well above and beyond what might appeal to the mainstream, in this case, say, transportation user. Where advocacy, I think, really succeeds is where you acknowledge and you allow for those spectrums of opinions, the spectrum of opinions, but you find something kind of in the middle It's the mushy middle sometimes. Centrist is not always something that people like to hear when they're pushing for progress. But sometimes you need the different ends of the spectrum to help validate something in the middle that might appeal to a greater mass of people. And so there's an interesting alchemy that goes on there in advocacy. There's no such thing as too many groups pushing for too many things. You need a lot of voices. And sometimes you catch a wave at the right place at the right time. You can get something moved across, like some of what we've been seeing over the years in British Columbia and in some of the more progressive cities.
Your aim is to go down the middle of that and really to recognize, is that what you're getting at, that you are that, not to use the word centrist, like you said you didn't really want to use, but let's, for lack of a better term, that you're taking the centrist position, acknowledging the either sides, but pushing for realistic goals and goals that you believe could be beneficial and realistic on realistic timeframes?
Well, not necessarily, because in the end, that's a matter of judgment. So what qualifies as the center? I think the best place to start is on an evidence basis. So where you have research from academia, also some of the people out there in private consulting firms that do a lot of research on active transportation, some of them engineering planning firms that they actually do this stuff. They develop the designs, they pour the concrete, they make stuff happen on the roads and on our highways and interchanges and bridges and everything else. But they also feel something for, they feel attachment to what they're doing, and especially in academia as well. You only choose to research things usually that you're interested in, and where evidence shows that slower speeds from, say we're dealing with metric systems. So 50 kilometers an hour to 30 kilometers an hour results in an 80%, and I'm just sort of grasping at numbers here based on memory, but an 80% reduction in injuries and deaths on our roads. Well, the proposal to implement blanket speed limit reductions to 30 kilometers an hour in neighborhoods all across BC may sound like not a centrist, actually kind of an extreme request, but we want slower speeds, we want safer neighborhoods, we want fewer deaths and injuries, we want vision zero, in fact. So it may not be something that is seen immediately as something possible and doable, and yet evidence shows that slower speeds makes a huge difference. Safer passing distances makes huge differences. Better infrastructure, separated infrastructure makes a huge difference. So you may call, people can label it centrist or fringe or extreme or not strong enough, but we'll work off evidence, and ultimately I think that's what government often tends to respond to, as well as votes and populism and all.
Yeah, totally. You're exactly right. It just depends on your position on whether or not something is fringe or centrist. To a lot of people like myself, I know I've read a lot about the lowered speed limits and the stats behind them for pedestrians and for all types of people out there. And it just makes perfect sense to me. But for a lot of people, it is radical change. So I guess it just depends on where your starting point is and whether or not you consider that a reasonable goal, or you consider that wild progressivism.
Well, and where you're coming from makes a big difference. What your experiences are. All it takes is for someone who usually is behind the windshield of their car to have a couple of near misses, or even some scratches and things happen to them. My wife was just walking across the street and was about to get up on the sidewalk, and a vehicle made too tight, too quick of a turn, and with their fender actually scraped her leg. And so you could, I'm not suggesting anything about what her mindset was to begin with, but you could be anybody and start to realize, well, wait a minute, maybe we can all benefit from slowing down. Like myself, I spent many years, with my kids to school or to daycare, for work, for various reasons, driving. And I'd be one of those people reacting to the built environment and saying in my head, I can't even see where any of the traffic is. So you edge out, you drive across the line of walking, across a sidewalk. You maybe are in a bike path of some sort. And it's in recent years that I've realized, well, I'm advocate, I'm fighting for change, I'm pushing for good stuff, but sometimes I could be part of the problem too. So if I slow down, if I take my time, if I add 5-10 minutes to a half hour commute by actually responding and reacting to the rules of the road, doing what I'm told I should do by the Motor Vehicle Act, well, everybody will be safer. I'll change my mindset. And so what if, I'm shifting the balance of equity essentially on our transportation system? I'm a small piece in the bigger picture, but I'm helping things as opposed to making a bad problem worse. So it's easy to moralize like that, but I think sometimes if people just think about it, and especially during this pandemic time, the changes they've made in their life, and in some respects, while it's been very challenging, sometimes how easy it is, and then the impact of making some of these changes, how you feel better, less stress. Life slows down a little bit, but everybody's a little bit safer. In some cases, a lot safer. I think this pandemic has shown that sometimes vast change is very much possible. We just have to change our mindset.
And you can get used to things that you thought maybe weren't possible before. There's been a lot of getting used to things that aren't so great right now, but hopefully, I always think, like I've talked about this in the previous podcast during this time, that I don't like to necessarily discuss positive outcomes from COVID-19 because there's so much terrible, so much destruction and death and stuff like that. But if we should be able to take something from it. And that leads me to my next question is, in the fall issue of Explore, one of my columnists was writing about the bike boom that we're seeing during this time, and a lot of bike shops selling out all over the cities and all over Canada. And I just wanted to talk about that for a second, because you talk about change and talk about mindsets, and I wanted to ask you if you've noticed this within your membership, and what do you think about COVID-19, about this slowdown, spurred a boom in cycling?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I can think about our membership, but I don't know that those people who are already fully bought in to a particular way of life, particular approach to transportation, that much changed for them. I think about in BC, our regional transit operator, TransLink for Metro Vancouver, in 2011, I think it was, issued a major report on active transportation and cycling in particular, where they, I think building off of our research in Oregon, defined those who are, well, it's self-explanatory, interested but concerned in cycling, comprised about 40% of the region, so about 1 million people. It's those 1 million people who I think the mindset was changed, and potentially some of the other group, the other segment would be the no way, no how, forget it, not interested in cycling. Those people, whether they amount to 1 million, 1.5 million, 2 million people, what have you, they represent the people whose lives were necessarily changed. So, you know this. There's no going to school or work. There's no going to gyms or community centers. There's no meetings, no bars or restaurants, no playgrounds. So the things that people used to do, they used to commute, they used to have their travel routines, they got their morning podcasts, they're outside, seeing the sky, the activity, even if they're in a car, what have you, they're part of the outside world, but all that was gone. So you lose your commute, your fitness routine, your time with friends, your meeting spaces, your play, your recreation, everything that you would have normally had. Now you're confined to your home, maybe a few blocks radius, your neighborhood, you go shopping. Well, as soon as our provincial health officer, and this happened before she said anything, but Dr. Bonnie Henry encouraged people to get out and walk and cycle. Even before she did that, people were looking around. I think if they're anything like me and you're starting to think, well, what is the both the least and the most that I can do to try and recapture some sense of normalcy? And if you had a bike, even if it was sitting in your garage, shoved away in some back corner, needs a little tune-up, well, that was the key to freedom, to some exercise, to some social time, to trying to recreate, again, people who were having a daily commute, whether it's by bike or some other means, they're losing out on a number of hours per week to get out there and see the world. So I think it's, those people, the interested but concerned, the people who had to figure out some new routines, some new outlets in their lives, and who also appreciated the fact that we can embrace being unplugged outdoors. We were all watching screens a ton, but as soon as we could get away from it, let's get outdoors, enjoy some simple pleasures like just seeing and hearing the outside. And also then understanding that, well, in a pandemic environment, as we're learning about this virus, we may not know everything, but we've got pretty good evidence to suggest that being outside in the open air is a great thing. And so all I can say is, to your question, it was one of those things that even if a bike wasn't filtered into your life in many ways, the ability to weave it in to replace some of what we lost was right in everybody's faces. The bike shops, just basically fulfilled this latent demand, and nothing's changed, which I think has resulted in everybody starting to see what that very small so-called fringe of people who are cycling all throughout their lives, what we've known this whole time. And it's a real thrill to see that open up to more and more people.
Yeah, it's really interesting to me too, because just like you said, it seemed like such a quick light bulb went on people's heads, that it was, like you said, the latency was always there, that people just knew, like, everyone has experience with a bike, like most people have experience with a bike at some point in time in their life, and then to find out that it was just, when maybe some time was freed up and they were looking for the simple pleasure, and it was so available and easy to do. But I wonder, though, as you talk about sort of these people that were interested, the interested and concerned, and the people that are going to now sort of join the the cycling revolution to some degree. What are going to be the lasting effects of that? I mean, are you, do you think have you seen an increase in membership? Do you think that advocacy is going to be better received by the general public, or do you hope for lasting effects? Do you predict lasting effects from this?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, so there are probably a few factors that drive that. I mean, number one, we've definitely, it being a small nonprofit with, not a lot of revenue, but not a lot of overhead. We've really been able to adjust to what has been now, in various stages, a lockdown of sorts, and been able to focus on working on the policy, the research, basically advancing the ideas, as well as some of the programs that we have that we think are part of the solution. And so in getting some of that messaging out, it's beyond communications. It's trying to actually serve up some policies, some ideas, some solutions that could be taken up by different levels of government. So we have seen greater receptiveness to our ideas from, again, various levels of government as well as the public. But I think what the government knew to do on its own, and I'm sure the moment, depending on when that thinking was starting, whether it was January, February, or really in earnest in March when the first lockdown started, was they were working on trying to figure out, well, how can we ensure that, some of the stuff I was describing, getting people to get out, to carry on with their lives and discourage some of the negative population health outcomes of sedentary life, of God knows what would be going on for people shut in for too long, is that they realized if we can implement some very simple, cost-effective measures to open up space on our roads and sidewalks, to slow down traffic, and to really discourage people from using their vehicles at all if they don't need to. And that, of course, dovetailed nicely, unfortunately, but nicely with the shutdown of workplaces, that it was more public embracing and encouragement of cycling and walking than we'd ever seen before. I would add transit into that, although there's different perspectives on transit. I've been using transit a lot, but I think a lot of the focus on keeping our transit system afloat and also demonstrating the positive health factors. At least they're no more negative than using a vehicle. Transit is part of the solution as well. So I think as well, we've seen the federal government attempting to step up and reroute funds to the provinces in different ways to encourage the type of infrastructure development that supports cycling and does so very cost effectively and very quickly. So one of the ways you can just see the evidence of all this is there's a website called livingstreets.ca, run by one of our coalition members, Best. They run the bicycle valet out here in Vancouver in various spots, but they basically have a map that shows the growing number of cities and towns that have started to implement slow streets, what's sometimes called flow streets, road reallocations, in some cases responding to the provincial government and what they put out in terms of some very helpful guidelines for how to allocate space in different ways. So all that stuff is happening here, as I'm sure you've heard in other cities. Paris is actually quite a significant example. But the idea is that, not to use the pandemic as an excuse, but as an opportunity to start implementing some of the measures that could be helping us over the next decade as we, start to attack the next, and I'd say current great challenge, which is the impacts of climate change. So yeah, there's a lot of good stuff going on in amongst the, this hard time. It's the silver linings approach, and we see great signs that while we'd like to be seeing more always, we've seen like an appropriate amount of attention put to active transportation. So we'd like to see that going.
Maybe it's a time when people are seeing so much change that they're just receptive to change as a whole. And that's going to be a secondary benefit of working it in at this time, that we're going to say, like, listen, if we're going to rebuild some societal norms, then let's do so right now, because when things start to get back to normal, whatever the new normal will be, it'll be easy for people to fall into their old habits, I think, pretty quickly, unless we get ahead of it, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's just such a volume of stuff that's going on. I mean, over 300, I'm pretty sure 300, over 320 or 360 new patios, street-side patios taking up parking spots, but providing more space for people to be outdoors and eating safely and helping the restaurant and food retail sector. That's enormous. And lots of other examples. City of North Vancouver is a big one, Victoria. And I could just go on down the list. I'd probably omit some significant ones by just trying to mention a couple. But I guess what I'm interested in seeing, I guess to your point, is when all this is said and done, and I mean, they're said and done from a real practical perspective in terms of the vaccine, and okay, everybody's basically out of the woods and we're good. but even moving on in a way that still would represent not yet a vaccine, but everybody having kind of gotten used to the new world and how we were supposed to live life. Still, though, even without a vaccine, I think what we'll find the next time, say, the Ministry of Transportation here in BC does a general population survey, is an increase to the numbers that they found last time, which, I mean, it's fascinating to see. So in BC, 67% of British Columbians are occasional active transportation users, which gives you a sense of like, this is not about, cyclists versus drivers or about any of these labels. It's just about what's part of people's lives.
That's an incredible number. If you had asked me to make a guess at that, I wouldn't have. How do you define active transportation? Just so our listeners are totally clear, because we are talking so much about cycling, but if you want to define that a little bit clearer, so people understand who maybe are not privy to it.
Typically, any mode that does not rely on the use of a motor vehicle. So, for example, walking, cycling, scooters, wheelchairs or other assisted devices, horseback riding, as it is often used in some rural areas on trails as a form of transportation, can be considered as well. And interestingly, with our provincial ministry giving out grants every year for active transportation infrastructure, one of the grants was for paddling. So a paddling route, I hesitate to call it infrastructure, although maybe that's what it's categorized as, but in an Indigenous community where that can be used for transportation. So,
but it's not recreation we're talking about. We're talking about doing it for a purpose.
Yeah, doing it for a purpose, whether it's for commuting or for utility, to go shopping, to get to a dentist appointment, for example, that type of thing. Now, it's some fuzzy lines based on how people report out on their activities, but generally that's it.
When we're looking at what you want to see going forward and what's going on right now, within urban environments particularly, and we can talk about outside of cities in a bit, what do you see some key main challenges to active transportation that the BCCC is working on right now?
Well, it's huge because it's culture. It's just the way sometimes cycling is viewed as an exclusive activity by a specific group of people, as opposed to something that, again, under the banner of active transportation, represents the needs of people to have more options to get around without having to rely on a motor vehicle, which is an inequity in terms of the costs of driving.
Yeah, when did that happen? When did cycling become an elitist sport? I feel like in my lifetime, I'm like, this wasn't always the way. Like, I don't know why riding a bike would be considered some sort of elitism. It seems like it's the exact opposite to me.
Yeah, well, back to the use. If you're using it for recreation, like it's defined actually in the Motor Vehicle Act, a play vehicle, right? If that's what you're using it for, then anybody can do it. Girls, boys, young, old, great. But I think once people started to use it more frequently as a mode of transportation, I think about some of the stories. I was doing some research for a book, and it's still running in the background, but a book about the rise of cycling advocacy and perhaps cycling in general in the Vancouver region. It sort of, with the introduction of the 10-speed in the 1970s, and suddenly cycling becoming something that, younger, fitter people, even now into the professional realm, the people would want to use for physical health. And, oh, by the way, it can get you places quicker and with great ease. And, to use the 10-speed and then other bikes throughout the 70s and 80s as a form of transportation from A to B is something that you would have likely only found, or mostly have found, young, fit men doing. So, that sort of fits, whether it's a stereotype or it's based on the data. Largely, for a long time ago, it was based on the data that you would correlate the young, fit, professionals for people who are riding with the people who would then be serving as advocates to be pushing for the things that they wanted to have changed about a city, about the way highways are used, shoulders are delineated, and all that type of thing. That would have been seen as elite because you've got young male professionals.
And the urbanism of it too, right? Like the people who live in cities. I remember my dad said something funny. We had a conversation a while back where he said when he grew up, all like the fit, healthy people lived in the country. And then at some point in time, it switched, and you saw people who lived in the cities, being more interested in active transportation and cycling and walking, and people who lived in, I'll quote him, people in the country does not really walking much further than the end of their driveway. And I wonder if that has something to do with it. If you are using your bike to get to work, for example, then you're probably living downtown, professional, higher income, whether or not these things are true, but perhaps that's just the perception of it.
Yeah, and sometimes perception in a way can shape the truth. You sort of encourage more people of a certain type to then do that same activity. But I think a lot of what the early advocates were doing was trying to get more education happening, more education programs for the public, and more infrastructure, the types of things that would actually benefit all types of users, because they recognize that this is not just for them. This is an imperative. I mean, this is a cultural imperative that touches on environmental issues, again, cost issues related to the oil crisis of the 1970s, and this fed right up on into the 80s and the 90s in terms of where people's interests lay, and the fact that that type of thing would also attract a lot of women. And in fact, there were a lot of women who were very formative and critical to the foundation of advocacy organizations and their efforts over the years as well. And a lot of people are just not aware of that, nor do I think are the average people who just see cycling as something that happens at the periphery of their vision as they're driving somewhere. And often they're still not noticing the great change that's happened in the last couple of decades, which is not just more women, but more families, people with a kid on the back, cargo bikes, moving stuff around from, like, I use my bike with a milk crate and bungee cords on the back for Costco runs. And I think, the more that sort of thing happens, the more we're dispelling that stereotype. And so that's, I think, what politicians are recognizing, and these types of surveys that show a broad diversity. I mean, here's another one. 33% of households have at least one child who usually walk or bike to school. And that may seem like nothing compared to how you and I grew up. But given what's happened in the last couple of decades with the crushing dominance of car culture, to see at least 1 in 3 kids walking or cycling to school is a great breath of fresh air once again.
About that comment you said about the crushing dominance of car culture, I mean, I look at cycling and active transportation as city planning takes such a huge role in enabling that. But are you fighting against like 100 years of city planning across North America, across Canada, across BC that didn't prioritize that? I mean, is that the mountain we're looking at, or what do you see as the future in terms of how cities are planned?
Yeah, if you're talking about the built environment, what is the state of the roads, the sidewalks, the multi-use paths, and where on the right of way you can actually put cycling infrastructure? Oh, for sure, that's a fight. But in terms of the people, I mean, and so that's the environment, by the way, that has been built. This goes back to the 50s, 60s, 70s. Of course, that's a struggle, because you need a lot of money and a lot of will, as well as sometimes the legislative freedom to be able to move things and change things, and lots of time. But again, if you're going to talk about the people, I would say no. It's nothing that can be measured necessarily, but there's great evidence, of this qualitative evidence, that over the years, there has been this exciting new crop of young men and women come through planning schools, planning programs anywhere in the world, but come to BC at some stage in their lives, and they're embedded in the city of Vancouver, in the North Shore municipalities, in cities all across actually the province. I see it in Nelson, I see it in Courtenay, I see it in Nanaimo. I'm hearing about these people who actually get it and are seeing the types of cities that we need to build now and for the future. And perhaps, I mean, this may not be valid at all, but perhaps the engineering discipline maybe is a little bit behind, because, and I don't know why. Maybe because historically it's been more male dominated. Maybe historically it's been very much rooted in past principles around engineering. Maybe urban planning has changed faster and in different ways than engineering, but the two work together. And so that type of evolution has been happening too. But I think where we're seeing that struggle is, in municipalities, you see these people doing their jobs, and you see them at the forefront trying new things in smaller geographic and urban areas, pushing things forward. In the regions, often they don't have the jurisdiction over roads, over highways, over transportation in general, though they come up with a lot of regional plans that support active transportation on trails and for the roadway networks that pass through their boundaries. It's at the provincial level, I think, where you have maybe the greatest resistance on the basis of the fact that they have largely been responsible for highways. They used to be called the Ministry of Highways, right? Now they're Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure. But I think you have people with decades of experience doing things in a certain way in terms of major infrastructure projects, highway operations and maintenance. And even with the planning that goes into that, sometimes it's all just, sent out of house. It's all contracted. It's all third parties. And so unless you have a provincial government that is not just committed, but very much aware of their blind spots, very much aware of the issues of, you have turnover from a political perspective, but sometimes staff-wise, you have this continuity that just won't change and budge over the decades. I think until that is recognized and seen that, much like in health, much like in childcare, much like in mental health and addictions and all these other areas, you need a provincial portfolio to really evolve and move forward. And sometimes ripping off those band-aids is really, really hard. And there's no easy way to do it. But until they recognize that, I think the provincial government will be the toughest nut to crack in terms of that change that you've asked about.
That would be when you'd start to see a more widespread change as well, rather than Vancouver or Victoria being these little hotspots that are building bike lanes and everything, that you might see it trickle down throughout communities all over the province and in other provinces too. I definitely get what you're saying there. Is that what are you focusing on that as the BCCC, going after the province specifically? Do you feel like some of the municipalities, like say, I'm just going to say Vancouver and Victoria as the two biggest ones, obviously in the province, like, do you feel like they're kind of on the right path and you can help them and you're focusing on a provincial level more?
Well, I guess I think they are on the right path, but I worry sometimes that the actions don't match the words. Our goal is not to be partisan, to think NDP versus Liberal versus Greens, and the Conservatives may even be somewhere in there, though they haven't held power for decades and decades and decades. But you've got a multi-party system, and everybody's, again, saying the right words. But there's a lot of political risk to taking the actions. And I think sometimes they suffer from the perception also that working on active transportation would be unpopular. But that's where we do, and that's exactly where we focus our work, is to speak to them about what we're seeing and hearing at the grassroots, at the local level, with these smaller organizations, and not in Vancouver and not in Victoria, where you've got 30 plus years of history of advocacy and a real maturity in the approach there. But you've got all these other towns and districts and cities elsewhere in the province that are just trying to keep people from, to be honest, to keep people from dying, like on the highway shoulders, and trying to just deal with some of the gaps in the infrastructure, let alone all the injuries that are just, they can wreak havoc on our communities in ways that I don't think we'll fully realize until we actually achieve something like Vision Zero. But there's great impact to be had from mobilizing and making clear to government that there's enormous benefits to changing the laws, to making them, we've got 60 plus.
So what are those laws that you'd like to go after?
Well, the Motor Vehicle Act, first of all, in its name, you see the problem. It's the Motor Vehicle Act. There's no acknowledgement or recognition of road safety. We'd like to see it be the Road Safety Act. I mean, that's the first of 24 recommendations that we've made in a white paper, basically a long position statement that we've worked on for a couple of years with some other partner organizations who feel the same way we do. And there's many of them across BC and many individuals who are saying, why don't we have safe passing law? Why don't we have slower streets, or at least to lift the inordinate restrictions on municipalities to apply blanket speed limit reductions in their communities?
I was reading about that on your website, that I didn't realize the complexity of that. I wonder if you could break that down quickly for some of our listeners on why municipalities aren't just doing it quite so easily.
Well, they have the freedom to. So first of all, in the Motor Vehicle Act, I believe it's stated relatively explicitly that if a municipality wants to reduce the speed in their local urban area from 50 kilometers an hour to 30, they can just do it. However, the catch is you must sign that change, that speed limit variation, the variant, at every block. I'm going to say it's a really significant burden. It's administrative, but it's also cost-wise if you want to do that for all your neighborhoods. So basically, places, communities where you have streets without a center line. So if you want to apply 30 kilometer, make it 40, make it whatever you wanted. But if you want to make it different for those neighborhoods, you would have to spend millions and millions of dollars in signage, which sounds kind of like a weird, tweaky little thing, but it's a significant burden. And that's the reason why municipalities won't do it. And in repeated resolutions, essentially requests from the Union of BC Municipalities, so you've got, it's literally a union of BC municipalities, but involving executive members, which are mayors and councillors and leaders from municipalities all across the province. Since 1999, there have been close to a dozen resolutions asking for, in various different ways and for different reasons, for the ability to apply blanket speed limit reductions and to relieve the municipalities of that burden. And time again, the province has said no. And it's basically the legal exposure that they feel that they would be under if there were to be a challenge to a ticket, or if there was some crash that was a result of speeds and in some way that highlighted, oh, this is a problem. The driver did not know that this was meant to be a 30-kilometer-an-hour zone. Well, there are so many different ways we can communicate that these days. There's different ways we can approach signage. There's so many. There's so much that we can do, even from our driver training, from the ICBC end of things, which is our public insurer. That I don't believe that that's a real problem, and many people also don't believe that that should be the reason why we don't lower speed limits. But that's the excuse given by the province time and time again. So that's a tough one.
I guess what it comes down to, too, when you look at changing laws and regulations and allowing municipalities greater freedom, I mean, it really does come down to education above all, though, because, I mean, laws are one thing, but if you can't educate people on why they are there, you can't get support of the municipalities. It is an interesting question. And that's, I think, that what you said earlier relates back to a big hurdle being culture. Rather than like real tangible things that we can't get past.
Totally. Well, what if we, so not just educate, I mean, education is huge. So what if we improved and the education delivered by the driver training authorities and licensing authorities, number one? What if we also promoted, like, more proactively, instead of trying to shame and police pedestrians and people on bike, what if we tried to promote this as, this is where we're going as a province, this is what we need to do as a society, and this is how you do it. You drive slower, you have more space and more safety provisions for walking and cycling. So if we could then be promoting more the behavior that we want to see. But then lastly, I'd say, back to the infrastructure side of things, if you have those two measures in place, so educating and communicating, while also then incorporating, curb bulges, speed humps, signage that's not just about speed, but about, this is a community with kids in it, so please be careful. And in fact, involved. And we see the communities do that on their own sometimes. You actually make the requisite changes in the physical environment, the built environment, as we call it. You have all the right factors there for people when they're otherwise going to be, really gunning their car through neighborhoods, to start to feel like, oh, both consciously and subconsciously, I know I've got to change my behavior. And in fact, it's worth it. I'm going to slow down. I might lose a minute or two, but of course, look at the benefits to society. It would be enormous.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, I live on a street that's a very well-used cycle path, and I have noticed that the time I've lived here, for a long time, there's a no turning regulation during rush hour to get on here, and the police were often there ticketing people all the time, no left turns, ticketing all the time, and I never really saw any change. And recently, there have just been these simple barricades put up that just with a big sign that says, like, this is a community, watch for pedestrians and cyclists, and I have noticed an anecdotal reduction of traffic on this road, through traffic, just because I think people see that, just like you said, and thought, no, I don't need to drive down there. If that's where people are going to be cycling and walking and skateboarding and walking their dogs, I don't need to. And I've seen that, the simple sign on a plastic barricade, do more than hundreds of hours of policing and ticketing since I've lived on this street. And it is quite amazing to see.
Yeah, and it's such cheap infrastructure, very cost-effective measures to get a huge bang for the buck. And it just really reflects, that Vision Zero talk that we're all very much committed to. Which, if you think about it, well, who wouldn't want to eliminate deaths and injuries on the roads? It just makes so much sense. But I think, without the actions, without that firm commitment, and even if it does result in political risk, this is, I think, first of all, the loudest shouters are often the extreme minority of the people who are pushing against something that represents where society is otherwise going. And also, I think just, politicians, whether it's in Canada or in BC, have yet to realize what I predict will be the truth one day, is that, oh, this is actually so extraordinarily positive and populist that it's such a vote winner. There are many people who, for various reasons, didn't like Vision Vancouver and Gregor Robertson, but this bike riding mayor, won 3 successive mandates and brought about huge change that has now led Vancouver to be world recognized as a very cycling friendly city. There's lots more to do, but that's the model I think we have to follow for the province. And I think it'd be, again, a very much a political winner for whoever's willing to step out and take the chance.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I remember when all the bike lanes came into the new bike lanes that came into Vancouver, and hearing people complain about them all the time, but they seem so beloved now. You know what I mean? Like, I don't really hear many people complaining about them. And even some of the changes I've seen during COVID-19 is, I forget, you might drive to Costco and see like a couple roads that I used to drive down are closed down, and I'm just like, oh yeah, no, that's fine, that's no big deal, I'll just continue along this thoroughfare and where I should be anyway, and people can enjoy drinking coffee and parking their bikes on a nice slow street just like they should be.
There will always be lots of roads and lots of options for cars. I doubt that will change. I think anything extra that's given up for people who want to get active, want to be on foot or on bike, and again, strollers, wheelchairs, all sorts of the new devices. That's what we want to see, more of that.
What you're really talking about is cooperation. We need better cooperation of everyone who wants to use our transportation thoroughfares. And is that possible? And, is it possible to have everyone cooperating when we do have vastly different needs, from commercial trucking to someone who just wants to walk their dog?
Yeah, I think there are vastly different needs, but so much the vast, disproportionate amount of space on our entire road and highway network has typically been given up to trucks and cars, that I think as long as, there's an intelligent approach and there's the right political leadership and then the appropriate legislation and regulations to support it all. I mean, it's a very difficult and subtle mix, but it's the only way to go forward. I can't see any other way. But again, I think, seeing as every single person who decides to get out of a motor vehicle and use a bike, a scooter, a mix of being on foot and transit, some other way to get to and from the places that they would otherwise get to through a motor vehicle, you're just making things easier for everybody else who remains in their vehicle. And the legislation to support that, it's, some people would be quite cynical and say, oh, it's just the words on paper and that's not quite enough, but it's an integral agreement, because beyond the naming of it, going from Motor Vehicle Act to Road Safety Act, but there's 24 other recommendations in there, which doesn't make it something, that's ripe for sexy sound bites, but there's all the right stuff in there, all the right ingredients, at least in our recommendations and a lot of what other people are fighting for, to ensure that there's the right enforcement of rules that will protect vulnerable road users, that the right fines will be in place, the right infrastructure would be built, there'd be the right definitions of e-bikes, and what's an e-bike and what's not an e-bike, and where they belong, and whether they should be licensed, whether they can be insured. These are things that people are grappling with in a very real way every day. But I tell you, you go out with if you go out on the road right now with an e-bike with fixed pedals and a particular speed, suddenly you might not be able to claim your space on a particular bike route in a particular place, either in this province or in any province. There's no federal regulation, there's no provincial regulatory framework in place. So in a way, it's a bit of the Wild West. And so until you start to corral some of these definitions and standards and regulations into one place, you're going to continue to see a lot of confusion, a lot of people in places where they shouldn't be, at speeds they should not be at, doing things they shouldn't be doing, and hurting other people. And that's where you end up then with the clash and that perception that it's a fight between different types of users. We're all just trying to get around.
I totally agree with that. It's just like, everyone just wants to get where they're going safely and efficiently. And it is a good argument, too, when you think of the people who maybe just don't want to get on a bike. They're just never going to get on a bike. You say, well, if you got 100,000 people on bikes, that's 100,000 less cars in your way on the highway as you're driving across the Port Mann Bridge or something like that. So, there are definitely ways to appeal to people, even who might not have any interest in the infrastructure or the cycling themselves, for them to see benefits of getting people in off the highways, off the roads, and off the to ease the traffic jam that's just getting worse and worse and worse and worse and worse.
Yeah.
And I drive. I mean, I have a car. Like I enjoy active transportation, but I drive, and you sit there, and there's always that great quote when you're sitting there in traffic, and you think like, I'm not in traffic, I am traffic.
Yeah.
And what can I be doing better?
Yeah. And I was going to say, and the irony is that so many of our political leaders, the members of the Legislative Assembly here in Vancouver, in Victoria, sorry, in BC, so many of them are people who ride bikes not just for fun and recreation, but also for transportation. So we've got some very compelling, young, dynamic, interesting cheerleaders. But I think there's either a lack of understanding of the desire for that expressed vocal leadership to support this, to affect so much positive change, again, for health, for tourism, for for justice reasons, and for, of course, everything just to support transportation and the increased mix on our roads. But it also, I think, get them a lot of votes in the next election, which, for all we know, may be happening sooner than it would otherwise be called for a year from now.
So to wrap that up, in 10 years, what do you want active transportation to look like?
For it to be provincial. And that may seem like a kind of an obscure response, but we know, for anybody in BC who in any city where they live, if they're in Victoria, they know what a good bike network and an active transportation culture looks like. And they know in many of the cities that we've already talked about and that we haven't named, moving along quite nicely. What we don't have is something in the province that makes it clear that there's a way to get to our ferries from a couple of municipalities away. And then when we get on the ferries, there will be an appropriate space for us to keep our bikes secure. And then when we get off, to then get to our destination. We're talking about regional transportation, whether it's for work reasons, for tourism reasons, for health and recreation reasons. I think in 10 years, if we could look at this province and say, we know what active transportation looks like here, as opposed to being somewhat of a new concept with a new strategy, unmet targets, a lot of inbound criticism from us to the people who run the show in the legislature and in the province as staff. It's still very new. In 10 years, it shouldn't be new anymore. It shouldn't be unknown, and it shouldn't be something where we scratch our head and question, like, where is the active transportation in BC at the provincial level? We should be able to see it. We should be able to see, some of these massive infrastructure projects like bridges, highway upgrades, and even existing highways where you've had people actually lose their life. To see them upgraded, to see our First Nations communities connected, and to have the ability to get around without needing a motor vehicle. That's really what it's all about.
In 10 years, getting around the province without a car, that would be something. That'll be nice to see, and I hope it gets there. And so if someone is listening to this podcast and they want to get involved in cycle advocacy, how would they look you up?
bccc.bc.ca. So I'll say that again, bccc.bc.ca. We rely on the support of people who care about cycling, who care about active transportation broadly, to join as members in BC. That would be, of course, appropriate. If you're outside of BC, you don't see the benefit of membership, donations, of course. We don't get paid to do the work that we do unless we're running a program that has user revenue or sponsorship involved. We do have a couple of those programs. One's called Bike Sense, one's called Kids on Wheels. But the work that we do, both to, for lack of a better term, lobby the province, but as well support our members in local areas where they don't have, paid staff to do this kind of thing, and to help them improve both their negotiations and the ideas that they send across to their local government, as well as local provincial contacts in that area, to help highway shoulders get built up better, and to help ensure there's space for cycling on bridges and that sort of thing. That's what we do. So for people who take an interest in that type of thing, to come to our website, read more, and of course support us or our members is fantastic. So I really appreciate you asking.
I perused your website quite a bit before we talked, and there is, for everyone listening, a lot of great information on there, not just in relationship to British Columbia, if you're listening from outside the province, which a lot of people are, but just cycling resources in general and cycling information. So it's worth checking out.
I appreciate that, David.
But Colin, thanks a lot for joining me today. I feel like we could have just kept going and going and going. There's so much to talk about in the world of active transportation and cycling, but we'll leave it here for now and give our listeners something to think about. So I do appreciate your time today.
Great. Likewise. Thanks so much, David. Take care.
It's amazing that when our base needs were reset, we gravitated towards the bicycle. It's such an incredible mode of transportation that not only makes us healthier and fitter, It helps lower our carbon footprint. It makes our roads safer and less congested. It's a win-win for everybody, even if you don't ride a bike, like Colin said. So check out the BC Cycling Coalition online, bccc.bc.ca. That's a lot of C's, or you can just Google BC Cycling Coalition. I think that's easier. Read up, discuss, argue, educate yourself, join the coalition. But whatever you do, get on a bike. Thanks for tuning in today. I'm David Webb, and hey, live the adventure.